next to the stage, we welcome the absolutely phenomenal Fiona Clouder. Now, Fiona, I guess we started appearing in the same conferences or so a couple of years ago. Fiona's background is very much from that diplomat perspective, having been the UK's ambassador to Chile and then regional ambassador, and very much leading on and shaping a lot of the broader strategy, I guess, with regards to South America. I'm really delighted to welcome Fiona to the stage here today. Fiona, if you want to start sharing your slides, etc., feel free to punch the buttons in now. One of the things that I think has been really great about this year's conference, as is always the case, is that it's very tempting to do sessions that just focused on, be it a particular theme or a particular geography. But actually, as we're seeing here, it's really important to be able to connect the dots and pull on all of those different strands from across the world. And so with that, we've talked a little bit about the DRC and Zambia earlier on today. We're now going to hop across the South Atlantic and we're going to go to Latin America. So with that, please everyone put your hands together for Fiona Clouder.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you also for the opportunity to participate in this really interesting conference. And I've been listening to some of the other speakers and learned a great deal this morning. And I'm by no means any expert on any of this, but I enjoy learning from others and also trying to look at some of the bigger picture. So I'm not going to be talking about the detail of mining. I think that's for the other experts in this conference. I'm going to be talking more about the overall picture, some of the concerns, and also I very much agree with what Priscilla was saying about the title of the conference. We can't create certainty, but it's how do we manage some of those risks? How do we create greater resilience in the system? And how do we build awareness of what's ahead of us? So hopefully you can see my slides, and perhaps for those of you who thought you were dialing into a mining conference, you might wonder from this one, are you in the right place? But this phrase of Estadi is something that I used a lot when I was the regional ambassador on COP26 for Latin America and the Caribbean, because I feel that time is slipping away from us. And this is something we're not thinking about enough in the world of mining, and why mining is so important for our world of the future. And of course, a lot of the discussion, a lot of my own interest in this comes originally from the drivers of climate change and hence the needs of the energy transition, with the energy transition, of course, requiring a vast increase in mineral production. And 4 years ago, when I first got involved in all of this, I asked the question, are we looking at the equation of what's needed versus the capacity of the mining industry to produce? And I think a further dimension of that is, are we looking at the capacity, the realities in a changing world, and the timescales involved? And we're running out of time is what really concerns me. But I do feel also there's a fantastic opportunity for Latin America. And I deliberately use the word for rather than in Latin America, because I do feel from Western governments, from Europe, from US, we've just been talking about some of this at a conference I'm currently at in Madrid. We tend to talk about what's in Latin America, whereas actually this is a moment for the region, for the individual countries, which are of course all very different. But this is their moment in the world, because Latin America, of course, has a lot of what the world needs for the future, for the energy transition, for economic security, and indeed mineral needs for defence and security in an increasingly uncertain world. But I also think it's important that we understand that the perspective from Latin America might look a little different. And I've always liked this image from a Uruguayan artist. And something I learned from my time in Chile is the world looks a different place, as it were, from if you view the world from a convention of what might be seen as upside down. But relationships for countries in Latin America are not necessarily always looking northwards, nor are they always looking to Europe or to America. And that's perhaps something we need to bear a little more in mind and to listen more about what the region both has to offer, what the region needs, and where we can build real partnerships. And I think this concept of partnerships is very, very important. So there are all sorts of statistics from all sorts of different sources. This is from the World Bank. I think probably a few years ago. There's excellent analysis from the IEA, from IRENA and others. But the picture is the same, that the volume of mineral resources needed is multiple values of what is currently in production. There is, though, general consensus that there are enough reserves in the world of the different minerals that are required, but there are differentials between the different minerals themselves, as others have been talking about, ease of production, and also the whole issue of processing and all the logistics that goes along with that. Recent analysis from the IEA has looked in more detail in different scenarios about those supply gaps, because what's clear when I got involved in all of this through the climate change world, we're looking very much at the goal of net zero by 2050 and recognizing that to meet that goal of net zero, a large number of measures needed to be put in place by governments, by industry, in all sectors all over the world. And that needed to go 5 times faster than it was to achieve what was needed by 2030 to meet the trajectory for 2050. We're now getting pretty close, actually, to that point. And of course, for all sorts of reasons, governments have perhaps lost focus and momentum and change of views on net zero. The supply gaps are there. They are different for different materials. But also, in an increasingly uncertain world, we have more problems actually in production. And so what I feel, going back to the timescales, is we're not always thinking about in what time frame do we need to address these supply gaps, and are we putting the measures in place now to try and reduce those risks. And those risks are not just about getting the stuff out the ground, it's also about the money involved, it's about the people, the skills, the capacity, the infrastructure that is needed to deliver this work. And of course, also, mining itself is not something that can be turned on or off overnight. The average for a mine to go from exploration to production can be decades, an average of over 16 years. We haven't necessarily got 16 years for the volume of both new mines and increasing productivity that is needed. And this is where technology is going to play an ever more important role. Other speakers have also talked about some of the pressures and tensions in mining, the very important relationships with communities. And I always think this is a very powerful slide, looking at the concurrence of those different risks of water, of conflict, of food insecurity impacting on communities in the very areas where mining projects are located. But we're also seeing, I think, progress across the world in recognising the importance of engaging with communities and not just doing this in a tick box ESG type exercise, but about building real partnerships right from the start of considering possible exploration through to all the stages that are involved in the mining life cycle. And also, it's not just, of course, about getting the stuff out the ground. It's very much about the processing side of things and ultimately creating value-added products. And there, of course, we see huge domination by China in terms of processing capacity. And that in itself raises, I think, particularly important considerations. We, of course, have a very different approach by the US and a desire by the US to exclude China from much of the processing and production chains. I think there are real questions about how realistic that is. But also with regards to Latin America, I think it's very important we respect and understand that countries there have very different dynamics in their relationships. Both China and the US are important to countries in that region, and trying to force a choice is not in anybody's interest. Another issue that I feel that we're not thinking about enough is, will it become too hot to mine? Climate change is happening. Whilst governments may have moved away from their intentions on net zero, that reality is ever looming. And that reality is going to exacerbate some of the risks that we've been talking about, particularly in relation to communities, to water, to energy, etc. And so I think there's a real issue that needs looking at further, is the increasing risk that climate change itself will affect mining, which is the very thing that we need more of in order to address climate change. And also there's the money. None of what we've been talking about today and in other conferences can happen without the necessary capital. And there are all sorts of ways in which different forms of finance can contribute to mining, from direct investment to various royalty agreements, but also very, very much also the role of government in creating the right sort of investment environment that will attract that capital, developing mechanisms between public and private sector to form partnerships, also looking at this in a much more integrated way, that it's not just about the mining investment itself, but it's about the infrastructure and logistics that are needed to develop the sector, and ultimately to bring benefit to communities and to the economic benefit of the countries with these resources. And so large volumes of money are needed. Trying to make that happen is not easy. And of course, the very large mining companies are driven by the commodity markets and return to their shareholders. But also to address what is needed for the world of the future, the junior miners have a very, very important role to play. That's a much more difficult space to operate in, where often very small companies may have a particular land asset, are constantly looking for investment, and trying to mobilise that in a more coherent way is, I think, going to be very important in the world of the future. And so for the countries in Latin America, and why is Latin America so important? Well, for example, on lithium, Chile, Argentina, Brazil control over a third of global production. The lithium triangle, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, has got roughly half the world's known lithium reserves. Chile, Peru, global leaders in copper, 35% of production, 31% of reserves. We've been talking about cobalt a lot this morning, and obviously the DRC, but it's important to realise that Latin America itself holds cobalt and other key minerals such as nickel, bauxite, niobium, and of course rare earths. And Brazil holds the world's second largest rare earth reserves. Also, countries like Chile are not just looking at copper, they're looking also to diversify on rare earths, cobalt, etc. And so the countries in Latin America who hold many of these commodity reserves have, of course, traditionally built their economies on those commodity markets. But it's very important to think now more about diversification of those economies, and particularly how benefits are brought back into country, economic and social benefits for the people of those countries. Also, the individual countries, understandably, are very much in competition with one another, but also there can be greater benefits, more alliances at local and regional level. And that's where both business and government partnerships can really help create that environment and mobilise capital. Governments have an important role to play in providing stability, facilitating licenses, coordinating infrastructure, and promoting collaboration, and ensuring that there is a stable fiscal and regulatory regime, because ultimately investors need that certainty, particularly going back to our theme today of a more uncertain world. There's been an excellent report just come out from the Institute of the Americas looking at critical minerals, looking at the Western Hemisphere's opportunity. I actually think that should be retitled to Latin America's opportunity. But that's a very detailed report that I recommend people have a look at if you're interested in this space. I also, though, just wanted to highlight a very important consideration, which is about the practicality of delivering these projects. This is a great friend of mine, Darren Quayle, who indeed taught me a great deal about mining when I was in Chile. And he's running an initiative. He now works for Warney. But it's a very interesting talk he gave at a conference, Resourcing Tomorrow, with the elephant in the room, which being Darren, he really did manage to get an elephant model, at least, in the room. But what he was saying is for all this intention, all this investment, all this drive on mining, the reality is that only 1 in 6 projects actually run on time and to budget. So even if all the predictions come off on mobilising all the money that's needed to deliver all the projects that are needed to meet the timescales that are needed, actually the practicalities mean that there are huge delays. And a lot of those delays, and they seem to have got worse over the last decade rather than better, are actually about things that the industry is perfectly capable of resolving. And so a lot of this is to do with skills. It's to do with project management skills. It's to do with leadership. And also it's about drawing on technology, can address some of those delays to ensure the projects do come in on time and on budget. And so going back to that Institute of America's report, key things that were highlighted in that as recommendations were the importance of permitting, but to ensure that that's done in an efficient and time-certain way. Water, that huge issue we've been covering this morning, has to be given greater attention, really being seen as part of strategic infrastructure for the mining sector. The very, very important involvement of communities and local partnerships. Getting some convergence on the standards that involve. There's some great work been going on by the big institutions to try and consolidate and converge those standards, which makes it easier for everybody and creates a transparent environment in which the sector operates. Looking also at financial strategies and stockpiling approaches of governments, and to understand how that relates to the midstream processing. Ensuring that your infrastructure and processing facilities are co-located and optimised in a sensible way. Trying to take out the risks with various financial mechanisms and support on getting some of these processing facilities off the ground quickly. Looking at traceability and rules of origin issues, and then also the very important issue of recycling, not just as a waste issue and a risk issue to be handled, but also looking at the capacity of recovery of minerals in that recycling process. And so a lot of this comes down to science and technology and thinking about how you can build those partnerships in a more strategic way. And again, I think that's a real opportunity where Europe and indeed America can link up with Latin America, indeed also Africa and other places in the world, to try and build real partnerships to mutual benefit, drawing on technology. And some of the needs of industry come down to that supply chain resilience, looking at alternative sources, handling of tailings, etc. Crucial issue of AI and automation, how technology can play a part in exploration, as well as increasing process efficiency and ore recovery. And also, of course, the whole issue of decarbonisation of the mining sector itself, as well as along with water usage. Very, very important to also look at biodiversity, environmental protection, how mining can be a more environmentally friendly, even environmentally positive activity. And thinking also about mines are not just about finding the stuff and getting it out the ground. Mines have a finite lifetime. So understanding that full life cycle, what happens at the end of a mine life, and restoration of land, very important. And of course, throughout all of this, issues of health and safety, automation, project management, skills development, leadership, etc. So I'm going to stop there, and Sarah, back to you and any questions. Thank you very much.
Fiona, as always, thank you so much. Absolutely fantastic. Massive round of applause for you. Now, I know we've got questions coming in, but a quick question from me first, if I may. And this goes really into your experience of being a diplomat. And when you are based somewhere like Chile as the ambassador for the UK, and so you're representing the UK, but building relationships that I suspect are deeply trusted relationships with different people within that country. How do you do that? Do you get given like a book from the FCDO saying this is how you do it? Or is it more you have this natural strength and skill and that's why you got the job?
Gosh, no. Well, I'd say with all due respect to my Foreign Office colleagues, I think things are a lot better now than when I got involved in all of this. So I got involved in the world of diplomacy a little bit by accident. My original career was actually in science and innovation, and I got more involved in international relations through that. And I eventually went to the Foreign Office to build a science and innovation network in our embassies around the world, and I work on science diplomacy. But so I came into diplomacy via a slightly strange route. Got involved with Latin America about 14, 15 years ago. I think it's been very much make it up as you go along. But I think the key thing is to actually learn from others. There is now far more structured training. And indeed, the countries in Latin America, and Chile is a very good example, Brazil, Peru, other excellent examples, have long established diplomatic colleges and a very rigorous training system, which we in the UK have been learning from. But you're right, a lot of this is about relationships. And I think you don't need to be a formal diplomat or an ambassador to do that. That's about all of us. And it's about listening. It's about trying to understand a little more, about trying to bring people together through forums like this. And I think diplomacy in the world of mining is very, very important. And we've all got a role in spreading that understanding. And so when I got interested in all of this, lots of my colleagues kind of said, well, what do you want to do that for? And thought it was a bit odd. But to me, this is about our world of the future. And so I think for all of us, including everyone on this call, kind of spreading understanding of why mining is important, what it means to all of us in our everyday lives who can live without it, and hence why it's needed for our world of the future and how we can make that into a positive, as well as addressing some of the risks and concerns.
So Fiona, why did you get involved, or how did you get involved and make this sort of shift into the world of mining? What drew you in?
Well, it was really, well, in fact, I mentioned Darren Quayle when I was in Chile, and of course, mining, very important part of Chile's economy. Darren taught me a lot about that, and then also obviously I learned very much from the Chileans themselves and from the big companies there. So I understood this was important. When I later got involved in climate change policy and the COP26 conference that took place in Glasgow, it seemed to me that we did make progress then in trying to move the world in understanding some of that. But nobody was actually thinking about where were all the materials going to come from for the energy transition. And I was due to retire from diplomacy anyway, and I had an opportunity to get a bit more involved in this. And I found it really interesting. And at first I thought I'd got it totally wrong and I must have misunderstood something really basic. But it turned out to be that there were these huge disconnects, and I think there still are. It's getting better, but there's still big disconnects between the kind of climate world, the energy world, the mining world, and ultimately the finance world that's needed to make all this happen. And so I think, again, all of us can play a role in talking to one another and trying to build understanding and look at how we can help move this forward.
Yes, it's amazing actually how instrumental COP26 was at, I think, kind of getting us over that tipping point of no, hang on a second, this is important. Because whilst I realized there were thousands and thousands of people at that conference, I was also there and representing geoscience in the UK and absolutely astounded that there was this misconception that these raw materials, what they just synthesize from thin
Yeah.
air. Like,
Yeah.
where do they come from? And also, I think as well the misconception that that mining is just coal mining
Yeah.
and not the minerals and metals and aggregates and everything else. So it was absolutely fascinating with regards to that.
Yeah.
There are two questions that have come through in the chat, if I may. But Fiona, if you do need to go, just wave at
No,
me.
it's fine. It's fine.
And the first comes from Grace, who of course is staring at you now. So Grace, we can blame you for this. But Grace is asking, do you see the primary role of Europe and the UK as a mechanism to provide capital for the development of Latin American resources, or do you see other key, I guess, ways of collaboration for Europe and the West to support or work with Latin America?
Right. Well, I think I'd like to say yes, but I think we have to be realistic. And so Europe and the UK can, of course, provide some of the money, but the US is really, really dominating in the role it's playing, both in terms of direct investment and also in terms of some of the geopolitical drivers and alliances. And we saw, for example, in February, uh, Rubio brought together key countries from across the region to talk about critical minerals. UK was also involved in that discussion. We've seen broader initiatives from the US, for example, on the Shield of the Americas initiative in March. But we're also seeing initiatives by Europe. And interestingly, only last Friday, there was the signing of the US-Europe relationship on critical minerals and in relation to Latin America. So I think the Western forces are coming together. There are also other players in this space. Sarah, you and I were recently in Riyadh at the Future Minerals Forum. And Saudi Arabia and others in the Middle East are also taking a greater interest in Latin America. And so this comes down to how do you mobilize that investment? How do you mobilize it at speed? And what can different players bring to the party? And so going back to your question, I think being realistic, the UK and Europe are not going to bring vast amounts of money. They'll bring some, but what else can those countries do? And that, I think a lot of that comes back to the research and technology. It comes back to also being conveners, shared values, and building wider alliances, for example, around infrastructure.
So I think as well, I mean, we've been involved in various conversations about sort of science diplomacy and all of that as well. And I think it is absolutely fascinating kind of working out what does the structure of that potentially look like? Because it's very easy to be inadvertently arrogant and say,
Yes.
we'll come and teach you all of this.
No, I think it has to be about mutual respect. And also very much the scientists in the host countries, they themselves have the detailed knowledge of the context in which they're operating. But it's can we bring something added to the party, and also in terms of developing, as it were, the wider ecosystem of how do you develop not just from the scientific knowledge, but how do you build that into relationships with industry? How do you then encourage spin-offs? How do you then further expand and develop your supply chains? What does this mean in terms of regional development? All these different things can layer and build on one another, where we've all got expertise to offer, but also we can all learn from one another.
Yeah, no, which I think is so, so important. One final question, Anthony. This question comes from yourself. And sorry, Grace, I should have invited you to ask your own question. But Anthony, do you want to pose your question to Fiona, and then we'll open this up to the broader panel.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, I just kind of jumped in. I was really curious to get Fiona's thoughts on this because I really enjoyed that talk. I must also say a disclaimer, my partner's from Mexico, so Latin America is something I have a lot of interest in and a little bit of kind of knowledge. But my question kind of relates to local destabilizers within Latin America. And, if we look at a number of countries that have gone through rapid political change in the last few years, like Chile, Peru, Bolivia, versus some of the more stable countries that are the largest economies, like Mexico, Brazil to an extent, and even Colombia in the last few years. What do you see as additional destabilizers to be aware of? And do you have any thoughts on what the best strategies would be to work within this and around this potentially, for example?
Yeah, and some of this I think is also down to perceptions of the region. So you're quite right. Of course, we've seen enormous left-right swings, and that's very much part of the culture and history of Latin America as a region, that you get these big political oscillations. And linked to that, of course, you then get instability, sometimes social conflict, and that can be a very difficult environment for investors. But I think what we are starting to see is both individual countries adopting and developing the critical minerals agenda as state policy. So Chile is, I think, an excellent example. Mining is obviously fundamental and has been for centuries fundamental to the economy of Chile. Under the second administration, the late President Piñera, you had, I think, a very interesting strategy developed linking mining and energy. You had a minister covering the two portfolios. You then had a very different left-wing government come in under President Boric that has just come to an end, where, although obviously a very different approach and indeed a difficult time in the country following the social uprising, but fundamentally still driving that forward. And Chile, I think, has done some really great initiatives under the Boric government. We've seen the National Lithium Strategy. We've seen greater focus on community engagement, but we've also seen greater complexity in the system, and something called permissology is a big issue, where it's enormously complicated to get the necessary permitting through in a timely way. We now have the right-wing government of President Cast has just come in. And again, I think a very interesting merger, this time of mining with economy, which I think sends a very, very strong and important system of the fundamental importance of mining. And we've yet to see the detailed policies to be articulated. But I think we can be confident the direction of travel will continue to build in a very, very positive way in Chile. In Argentina, you, of course, have, whereas Chile is a very evolved mining economy, in Argentina, it's much more about the enormous potential. But we've also seen under the Milei government, things come in like the RIGI law to create a much stronger framework that encourages investment. And I think what we're also seeing across the region is many more alliances, much more joint approach, recognizing that the established mining countries have enormous expertise and experience to draw on. But also there are things that the newer players can bring. And in all of this, I also think there is the great issue of unexplored reserves. There is a lot about the countries in Latin America that is not yet known about the mining resources and potential. And also, I think we're seeing the big institutions like the IDB, for example, like CAF, also trying to take this forward in a much more coherent and coordinated way in relation to infrastructure and wider economic and social needs of the countries. So I think it's a very exciting time ahead.
There you go, Anthony. That's some
Thank you. That was
experience there,
great.
isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you.
Brilliant. So with that, Fiona, thank you so much for your fantastic insights. Everyone, round of applause for Fiona Clouder. Thank you very much. Brilliant.